when an Apache warrior arrived at the gates of Fort Bridger, clutching his starving infant son. His desperate plea for milk would shatter the walls around a woman's heart that had been sealed shut by tragedy and forge a bond that would defy every law of the frontier, every prejudice of the time, and every reason they both had to never trust again. The November wind of 1882 cut through the Wyoming territory like a blade forged in hell itself. It howled across the sagebrush plains, rattling the wooden shutters of Fort Bridger and sending tumbleweeds spinning like ghostly dancers against the star-studded sky. The air carried the bite of early winter, sharp enough to freeze a man's breath in his throat and cruel enough to steal the life from anything too small or too weak to fight back.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Inside the fort's walls, oil lamps flickered behind frost-covered windows, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock the warmth they promised. The soldiers huddled close to their fires, nursing cups of bitter coffee and sharing stories that grew taller with each telling. Outside, the wind sang its lonely song, a sound that had haunted these plains since long before white men ever set foot on Apache land. But tonight, the wind carried something else. Something that would change everything. Tate Blackhawk pressed his back against the rough bark of a towering pine, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath. His moccasins had carried him 30 miles through terrain that would break a lesser man, but now his legs trembled with exhaustion. The buckskin shirt that had once fit him perfectly now hung loose on his gaunt frame, evidence of days without proper food, nights without rest. His long black hair, traditionally braided with eagle feathers and ceremonial beads, was now tangled and wild, whipping across his face with each gust of wind. But it wasn't his own suffering that had driven him to the very edge of madness. It was the tiny bundle pressed against his chest, wrapped in what remained of his wife's favorite blanket, a weaving of red and gold that had taken her months to complete during the long winter nights when their love was new and their future seemed as endless as the stars above. The infant in his arms had not made a sound for hours. Not a cry, not a whimper, not even the soft snuffling sounds that babies make when they dream. The silence was more terrifying than any war cry, more devastating than any bullet. Tate's calloused fingers found the baby's face in the darkness, feeling for the whisper of breath against his palm. They're barely perceptible, like the flutter of a butterfly's wing, but there, his son was still alive. Barely. Tate's dark eyes, usually sharp and alert as a hawk's, were now rimmed with red from sleepless nights and unshed tears. He had been a warrior of the Chiricahua Apache, trained from boyhood to endure pain, to push beyond the limits of human endurance, to never surrender in the face of impossible odds. But this was different. This was watching helplessly as his child slowly starved to death in his arms. The baby hadn't been able to keep down goat's milk, had rejected the mare's milk that other Apache mothers sometimes used when their own supply ran dry. For 3 days now, the infant had grown weaker, his tiny face becoming more gaunt, his cries becoming fainter until they stopped altogether. Tate had tried everything his people knew, had sought the counsel of the medicine women, had even considered the unthinkable, approaching the white settlements for help. And now, with his son's life hanging by a thread thinner than spider silk, he had done exactly that. The fort loomed before him like a mountain of timber and stone, its walls rising 20 feet into the night sky. Guard towers stood at each corner, and Tate could see the silhouettes of sentries moving back and forth, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. This was enemy territory, the heart of the white man's domain, the place where Apache warriors were shot on sight and questions were asked later. But desperation had a way of making even the most impossible choices seem reasonable. Tate had lost everything else that mattered. His wife, Dancing Moon, had died giving birth to their son just 2 weeks ago. The memory of her final moments still haunted him, the way she had smiled even as life drained from her eyes, the way she had whispered the baby's name with her last breath, Swift Arrow. She had died believing that their son would grow strong and proud, that he would carry on the ancient ways of their people, that he would one day be a great warrior like his father. Tate had promised her in that moment, with her blood still warm on his hands, that he would protect their son with his life, that he would never let any harm come to Swift Arrow, that he would raise him to be everything Dancing Moon had dreamed he would become. Now, as he crouched in the shadow of the fort's walls, that promise felt like a weight heavy enough to crush his soul. The attack on their camp had come without warning. Soldiers from Fort Apache had swept down on their small band like a plague of locusts, driving them from their ancestral lands, scattering families like leaves in a hurricane. Tate had managed to escape with his newborn son, but in the chaos, he had lost contact with the other survivors. He didn't know if his sister Singing Bird was still alive. He didn't know if his elderly father, Chief Iron Bear, had survived the long march to the reservation. He didn't know if anyone from his band was still free. All he knew was that his son was dying, and he was willing to risk everything, his freedom, his life, his very identity as an Apache warrior to save him. The main gate of the fort stood 30 yards away, flanked by armed guards who looked about as friendly as rattlesnakes. Tate had studied their patterns for the past hour, watching them pace back and forth, noting when they turned their backs, calculating his chances of approaching without being shot dead on the spot. Those chances, he realized, were slim to none. But Swift Arrow stirred weakly in his arms, and Tate felt the tiny fingers grasp at his shirt with what little strength remained. The baby's eyes opened for just a moment, dark eyes that reminded Tate so much of Dancing Moon that his heart clenched like a fist. In those eyes he saw trust. Complete, absolute trust that his father would find a way to save him. Tate had never been a praying man, not in the way the white missionaries understood prayer. But now, as he prepared to step out of the shadows and into the light of the fort's torches, he found himself speaking to the spirits of his ancestors. Great Spirit, if you are listening, give me the words to make these white men understand. Let them see not an Apache warrior, but a father who loves his son more than his own life. Let them show mercy where none has been shown before. The wind seemed to quiet for a moment, as if the very earth was holding its breath. Tate stepped into the light. The reaction was immediate and violent. Shouts erupted from the guard towers, rifles swung in his direction, and the sound of boots pounding against wooden planks filled the air. Within seconds, he was surrounded by a dozen soldiers, their weapons trained on his chest, their faces hard with the kind of hatred that had been bred into them from childhood. Apache! One of the guards shouted, his voice high with panic. Apache! At the gate, don't shoot! Tate called out, his English heavily accented but clear. He had learned the white man's language years ago, understanding that knowledge was just as important as courage in the fight for survival. I come in peace. I have baby. He held Swift Arrow higher, making sure the soldiers could see the tiny bundle in his arms. The baby's face was pale in the torchlight, his breathing shallow and labored. Even the most hardened soldier couldn't mistake the sight of a dying infant. Jesus Christ, one of the younger soldiers whispered, lowering his rifle slightly. It's just a baby. Shut up, Morrison, barked Sergeant O'Malley, a thick-set Irishman with scars across his knuckles and the kind of cold eyes that had seen too much violence. Apache baby'll grow up to be an Apache warrior. That's to end it now. Tate's English might have been imperfect, but he understood the meaning behind O'Malley's words. His grip tightened on Swift Arrow, and for a moment, the warrior in him surged forward. He could fight. He could take at least 3 of them down before they managed to kill him. But his son would die in the crossfire, and Dancing Moon's last wish would die with him. Instead, Tate dropped to his knees, holding his son above his head in a gesture of complete surrender.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
"Please," he said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, with the weight of absolute desperation. "My son, he is dying. He needs milk, woman's milk. I beg you." The soldiers exchanged glances, uncertain. This wasn't the kind of Apache attack they had been trained to repel. This was something else entirely, something that made even the most hardened veterans uncomfortable. "Where's his mother?" Morrison asked, his rifle still raised but his finger no longer on the trigger. Tate's voice broke as he answered. "She is dead. 2 weeks now. Baby cannot take other milk, only woman's milk. Please, I will give you anything. My horse, my weapons, my life. Just save my son." The commotion had drawn more soldiers from the barracks, and now a small crowd had gathered around the strange scene. Among them was Captain William Hartley, the fort's commanding officer, a man whose reputation for dealing harshly with Apache raiders was well known throughout the territory. Hartley was a tall, lean man with graying hair and eyes the color of winter ice. He had been fighting Apache warriors for more than a decade, had seen good men die at their hands, had buried soldiers who were barely old enough to shave. By all rights, he should have ordered Tate shot on sight and been done with it. But something about the scene before him gave him pause. Perhaps it was the way the Apache warrior knelt in the dirt, his pride stripped away by love for his child. Perhaps it was the sight of the dying infant, so small and helpless in his father's arms. Or perhaps it was the memory of his own son, who had died of fever 3 years ago back in Boston, and the way his wife had held their boy as life slipped away. "Stand down," Hartley ordered his men. "Lower your weapons." "Sir?" O'Malley looked confused. "It's an Apache, sir." "Could be a trick." "Look at him, Sergeant," Hartley said quietly. "Look at the baby. Does that look like a trick to you?" O'Malley reluctantly lowered his rifle, though his hand remained near his sidearm. The other soldiers followed suit, but their faces remained hard and suspicious. Hartley approached Tate slowly, his own hand resting on his pistol grip. "Stand up," he commanded. Tate rose carefully, still holding swift arrow against his chest. Up close, Hartley could see the exhaustion etched into every line of the Apache warrior's face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he cradled his son. "You speak English," Hartley observed. "Some," Tate replied. "Enough. What's your name?" Tate hesitated. Giving his real name would identify him as one of the warriors who had been involved in several raids against white settlements. But lying now seemed pointless. If he was going to die tonight, he would die as himself. "Tate Blackhawk," he said, meeting Hartley's gaze directly. "Son of Iron Bear, warrior of the Chiricahua." A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. The name Iron Bear was well known. He was one of the Apache chiefs who had been leading the resistance against the Army's efforts to force his people onto reservations. "I know that name," Hartley said slowly. "You've been involved in raids against our supply trains." "Yes," Tate said simply. There was no point in denying it. "And now you come here, to our fort, asking for help?" "My son is dying," Tate said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I am his father first, warrior second. I will do anything to save him." Hartley studied the man before him for a long moment. In all his years of fighting Apache warriors, he had never encountered anything like this. They were proud people, fierce and independent, who would rather die than show weakness to their enemies. For one of them to come here, to kneel in the dirt and beg for help, spoke to a desperation that Hartley could barely comprehend. "The nearest town is Bridger City," Hartley said finally, 40 miles south. "There might be women there who could help." "My horse is dead," Tate said. "I carried my son here on foot. He will not live 40 miles more." Hartley knew the man was right. The infant looked barely alive as it was. his tiny chest rising and falling with obvious difficulty. 40 miles through rough terrain would be a death sentence. "Sir," Morrison spoke up hesitantly, "there's Mrs. Hayes, Serafina Hayes. She lives about a mile from here, in that little cabin by Willow Creek." O'Malley snorted. "You mean the widow who talks to herself and keeps to herself? She's half mad, that one. Lost her mind when her husband died in the mine collapse." "That's not true," Morrison protested, his young face flushing red. She's been through a lot. Lost her husband and her baby, both within a month of each other. But she's a good woman, sir. A Christian woman." Hartley considered this. He knew of Serafina Hayes by reputation, a woman who had come west with her husband to start a new life, only to lose everything to the brutal realities of frontier existence. She had been living alone for almost a year now, keeping to herself, rarely venturing into town except for supplies. "And you think she might help?" Hartley asked. Morrison nodded eagerly. "She's got a good heart, sir, and she lost her own baby not too long ago. She might understand." Tate had been listening to this exchange with growing hope and desperation. The name meant nothing to him, but the fact that this woman had also lost a child suggested she might have the compassion to help where others would not. "Please," Tate said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me go to her. Let me ask." Hartley looked at him for a long moment, then at the dying infant in his arms. Every instinct he had as a soldier told him to arrest this Apache warrior, to throw him in the stockade and let the territorial judge decide his fate. But every instinct he had as a father told him something different. "You're asking me to let you go free," Hartley said. "To trust that you won't disappear into the night and continue your raids against innocent settlers." "I give you my word," Tate said, his dark eyes meeting Hartley's without flinching. "The word of a Chiricahua warrior. I will not run. I will not fight. I will submit to whatever fate you choose for me. But first, please, let me save my son." The courtyard fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the pine trees and the distant cry of a night bird. Every man present understood the weight of what was being asked and what was being offered. An Apache warrior's word was not given lightly, and once given, it was rarely broken. "Morrison," Hartley said finally, "you'll escort him to Mrs. Hayes' cabin. Take 2 men with you. If he tries to run, shoot him." "Yes, sir," Morrison replied, relief evident in his voice. "And if Mrs. Hayes refuses to help," Hartley continued, his gaze fixed on Tate, "you come back here. We'll figure out what to do next." Tate nodded, understanding the implications. If the woman refused to help, he would be returning to face military justice with no hope of saving his son. But it was a chance, the only chance Swift Arrow had. "Thank you," Tate said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. When was the last time he had thanked a white man for anything? But gratitude was a luxury he could afford now. In this moment, when his son's life hung in the balance, Morrison gathered 2 other soldiers, both young men who looked as uncomfortable with the situation as he did. They loaded their rifles and prepared to escort an Apache warrior through the night to the home of a woman who might be their only hope. As they prepared to leave, Hartley called out one more time, "Blackhawk." Tate turned back to face him. "If she helps your son," Hartley said, "you and I will have a conversation about your future. But if she's harmed in any way, if there's any sign of treachery, I'll hunt you down myself and make sure you die slowly. Do you understand?" "I understand," Tate replied. "But you do not need to fear for her. I seek only to save my son, not to harm innocent people." With that, the strange procession set off into the night, 3 nervous soldiers escorting an Apache warrior carrying a dying infant toward a cabin where a broken woman lived alone with her grief. None of them could have imagined that they were walking toward a moment that would change all their lives forever. The wind picked up again as they walked, carrying with it the scent of sage and snow, the promise of winter's approach, and perhaps, if they were lucky, the whisper of hope that had been absent from all their lives for far too long. The mile to Serafina Hayes' cabin felt like the longest mile Tate had ever traveled. Each step seemed to take an eternity, and with each passing moment, he could feel his son growing weaker in his arms. Swift Arrow's breathing had become so shallow that Tate had to stop several times to make sure the baby was still alive, his heart stopping each time until he felt the faint flutter of breath against his palm. Morrison led the way, his young face tight with concentration as he navigated the rough path by moonlight. The other two soldiers, Corporal Jenkins and Private Walsh, flanked Tate on either side, their rifles ready but not aimed directly at him. There was something about the situation that made even the most hardened of them uncomfortable with the idea of shooting a desperate father. "How much farther?" Tate asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and worry. "Just over that ridge," Morrison replied, pointing ahead to where the path crested a small hill. "You can see the light from her cabin through the trees." Indeed, as they topped the ridge, Tate could make out the warm glow of lamplight filtering through the windows of a small log cabin nestled in a grove of willow trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the whole scene looked peaceful and welcoming, a sharp contrast to the desperation that had driven them here. "She's still awake," Morrison observed. "That's good. Mrs. Hayes doesn't sleep much from what I hear." "Why?" Tate asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Nightmares," Jenkins said quietly. "Lost her husband and baby within a month of each other. Thomas Hayes was a good man, worked the silver mine up at Copper Ridge. Cave-in got him and 3 other miners. Mrs. Hayes was 8 months pregnant at the time. The shock of losing her husband brought on early labor," Walsh added. "Baby was born too soon, too small. Lived for about a week, then just stopped breathing one night." Tate felt his grip tighten on Swift Arrow. The thought of losing his son the way this woman had lost hers filled him with a terror so profound it made his knees weak. But it also gave him hope. If anyone would understand his desperation, it would be someone who had experienced the same loss. As they approached the cabin, Tate could see that it was well maintained, despite the isolated location. The porch was swept clean, the windows were clear, and there were even a few late-blooming flowers in wooden boxes beneath the sills. Someone lived here who still cared about making a home, even in the midst of grief. Morrison stepped up to the door and knocked gently. "Mrs. Hayes?" "It's Private Morrison from the fort. I'm sorry to bother you so late, but we have an emergency situation." There was a long pause, then the sound of footsteps crossing the wooden floor. The door opened slowly, and Tate got his first look at the woman who might be his son's salvation. Serafina Hayes was not what he had expected. Despite the stories of madness and grief, she appeared composed and alert, though there was a haunted quality to her green eyes that spoke of deep sorrow. She was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a simple bun and a face that might have been beautiful before grief had carved its lines around her eyes and mouth. She wore a simple gray dress and a wool shawl, and there was something in her bearing that suggested strength beneath the sadness. "Private Morrison," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What kind of emergency brings you to my door at this hour?" Her gaze moved past Morrison to take in the other soldiers, and finally settled on Tate. For a moment, her composure slipped, and Tate saw fear flicker in her eyes. But then she noticed the bundle in his arms, and her expression changed entirely. "Is that a baby?" she asked, stepping closer despite the presence of the Apache warrior. "Yes, ma'am," Morrison replied. "This is Tate Blackhawk. He's Apache, but he came to the fort asking for help. His son is dying, and he needs milk," Serafina finished, her eyes fixed on the tiny face visible above the blanket. "A woman's milk." "Yes, ma'am," Captain Hartley thought. "That is, we hoped, given your situation." "My situation?" "Seraphine's." Voice was sharp now, and Tate could see the pain that Morrison's words had caused. You mean because I lost my child? Ma'am, I didn't mean to. No, it's all right, Serafina said, her voice softening again. You're right. I do understand the situation. She looked directly at Tate for the first time, and he was struck by the intelligence and compassion in her gaze. This was not a woman broken by grief, but rather one who had been shaped by it, tempered by it like steel in a forge. What's your son's name? She asked. Swift Arrow, Tate replied, his voice barely above a whisper. How old is he? 2 weeks. His mother died in childbirth. Serafina nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without need for further words. She knew the weight of loss, the desperation of a parent watching their child slip away, the terrible helplessness that came with being unable to save the one person who mattered most. Bring him inside, she said, stepping back to allow them entry. All of you. It's too cold out here for a sick baby. The interior of the cabin was warm and clean, furnished simply but comfortably. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and oil lamps cast a golden glow over everything. Tate noticed immediately that there were no signs of the madness that O'Malley had described, no disorder, no neglect, no evidence of a woman who had lost her grip on reality. Sit there, Serafina said, indicating a rocking chair near the fire. Let me look at him. Tate settled into the chair, cradling Swift Arrow against his chest. Serafina knelt beside them, her experienced hands gently examining the infant. Her touch was sure and gentle, and Tate found himself trusting her instinctively. How long since he's eaten? She asked. 3 days, Tate replied. He cannot keep down goat's milk or mare's milk. He gets sick and brings it all back up, Serafina nodded. Some babies are like that. They can only tolerate human milk. She looked up at Tate, her green eyes serious. He's very weak, but he's not too far gone. If we can get him to nurse, he should recover. You can help him? Tate asked, hardly daring to hope. Yes, Serafina said simply. I can help him. She rose and moved to a cabinet, taking out a clean cloth and a basin of water. I'll need to clean him up first, and then we'll see about getting him fed. As she worked, Tate found himself studying this remarkable woman who had agreed to help him without question or condition. She moved with quiet efficiency, her hands gentle but skilled as she cleaned Swift Arrow and examined him more thoroughly. You know, she said without looking up, I've been wondering for months why God would let me keep producing milk when I no longer had a child to feed. It seemed like a cruel joke, a reminder of what I'd lost. She glanced up at Tate, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. But maybe it wasn't a joke after all. Maybe it was preparation. The soldiers had been standing awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do with themselves. Morrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes, we should probably head back to the fort. Captain Hartley will be expecting a report. You go ahead, Serafina said. I'll take care of things here. Ma'am, I'm not sure that's a good idea, Jenkins said nervously. He's still Apache, and there are standing orders about, he's a father trying to save his son. Serafina interrupted firmly. That's all that matters to me right now. She looked at Morrison with a steady gaze. You can tell Captain Hartley that I'll take full responsibility for Mr. Blackhawk's actions while he's in my care. But I won't have armed soldiers in my home while I'm trying to help a sick baby. Morrison looked uncertain, but something in Seraphine's tone brooked no argument. Yes, ma'am. We'll check back in the morning. After the soldiers had gone, the cabin fell into a peaceful quiet, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of Serafina preparing to feed Swift Arrow. She had settled into a chair opposite Tate, the baby now clean and wrapped in a fresh blanket. Are you ready? She asked softly. Tate nodded, carefully transferring his son to her arms. Swift Arrow was so weak that he barely stirred at the movement. But as Serafina positioned him and began to nurse, something miraculous happened. The baby latched on immediately, his tiny mouth working with the desperate hunger of someone who had been starving. The sound of him feeding was the sweetest music Tate had ever heard, and for the first time in days, he felt the crushing weight of fear begin to lift from his chest. Serafina rocked gently as Swift Arrow nursed, her eyes closed and a peaceful expression on her face. She looked, Tate thought, like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. "Thank you," Tate whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I will never forget this kindness." Serafina opened her eyes and looked at him. "Don't thank me yet," she said softly. "Thank me when he's strong and healthy and laughing like babies should laugh." She paused, then added, "Besides, you're not just saving his life. You're saving mine too." Tate didn't understand what she meant, but he could see the truth of it in her eyes. Somehow, in this moment of mutual need and unexpected grace, two broken people had found something they hadn't even known they were looking for. Outside, the wind continued to blow across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it the promise of winter and the whisper of change. Inside the warm cabin, Apache warrior and a grieving widow sat together in the lamplight, watching over a baby, who had become their shared miracle, their common hope, their bridge between two worlds that had never before found a way to touch. The night was far from over, and there would be challenges ahead that none of them could yet imagine. But for now, in this moment, there was only the sound of a hungry baby finally being fed, and the quiet joy of two people who had discovered that sometimes salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. As Swift Arrow nursed, growing stronger with each passing minute, Tate Blackhawk began to understand that he had found more than just milk for his son. He had found something he had never thought to look for in the white man's world. He had found family. The first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered windows of Serafina Hayes' cabin, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Swift Arrow had nursed 3 times during the night, each feeding stronger than the last. And now he slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle that Serafina had fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets. The change in the baby was remarkable. His skin had regained some of its natural color. His breathing was deeper and more regular, and for the first time since his birth, he looked like a child who might actually survive. Tate sat in the rocking chair beside the cradle, his weathered hand resting gently on his son's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall that had become the most precious rhythm in his world. He had not slept, could not sleep, afraid that if he closed his eyes even for a moment, this miracle might prove to be nothing more than a dream. But it was real. His son was alive, truly alive, and growing stronger with each passing hour. Serafina moved quietly around the cabin, preparing breakfast with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find comfort in routine. She had changed from her nightgown into a simple brown dress, her auburn hair braided and pinned back, but there was something different about her this morning. The haunted look that had shadowed her green eyes for so long seemed to have lifted, replaced by something that might have been hope. "He's beautiful," she said softly, not looking up from the egg she was scrambling over the fire. "Your son. He has your eyes, but there's something of his mother in the shape of his face." Tate nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Dancing Moon used to say he would be a bridge between worlds. She had dreams while she carried him, visions of him bringing peace where there had been only war. He paused, looking down at Swift Arrow's peaceful face. "I thought she was just hoping for too much. But maybe she saw something I could not." Serafina set down her wooden spoon and turned to face him. What kind of visions? She dreamed of him speaking many languages, of him helping our people understand the white man's ways and helping white people understand ours. She saw him as a healer, not a warrior. Tate's voice was barely above a whisper. She said the Great Spirit had chosen him for something special, something that would require him to live in both worlds. "And what do you think?" Serafina asked, moving to check on the baby. Tate was quiet for a long moment, watching as she gently adjusted Swift Arrow's blanket. "I think maybe she was right. Look at us, an Apache warrior and a white widow, caring for a child together. If someone had told me a week ago that I would be sitting in a white woman's cabin, trusting her with my son's life, I would have called them mad. And if someone had told me I would be nursing an Apache baby, feeling more purpose than I have, in months, I would have said the same thing, Serafina replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She returned to the stove, ladling eggs onto 2 plates and adding thick slices of bread that she had baked the day before. The simple meal smelled like heaven to Tate, who had not eaten properly in days, but even more than the food, he was grateful for the normalcy of it all, the quiet domestic scene, the gentle sounds of morning, the sense that life could be about more than mere survival. Tell me about your wife, Serafina said as she handed him a plate. What was she like? Tate accepted the food gratefully, but found himself hesitating. It had been so long since anyone had asked him about Dancing Moon, so long since he had spoken her name to anyone who might actually want to hear it. Most of the soldiers at the fort knew her only as the wife of an Apache raider, if they knew of her at all. She was light, he said finally. Not just in the way she looked, though she was beautiful, but in the way she saw the world. She could find joy in the smallest things, a bird's song, the pattern of frost on a window, the way shadows moved across the ground. She made me see beauty where I had only seen struggle. He took a bite of the eggs, savoring the rich flavor. She was the daughter of a medicine woman, trained in the healing arts. She delivered babies, tended the sick, prepared the herbs that could cure fever or ease pain. Everyone in our band went to her when they were suffering. She sounds wonderful, Serafina said, settling into the chair across from him with her own plate. She was. But she was also stubborn as a mule when she believed in something, Tate continued. And for the first time in weeks, he found himself almost smiling. She insisted on learning English, said it was important for our people to understand the language of those who would determine our fate. She made me teach her, even though I warned her that some of the warriors thought it was betraying our ways. And what did you think? I thought she was the wisest person I had ever known. She saw what was coming long before the rest of us were willing to admit it. She knew that we could not win against the white man's numbers, that our children would need to learn new ways if they were to survive. Serafina nodded thoughtfully. It sounds like she prepared you for this moment, in a way. What do you mean? You're here, talking to me, trusting me with your son. You're not just an Apache warrior anymore, Tate. You're a father who will do anything to save his child, even if it means crossing lines that your people would never expect you to cross. Tate considered this, recognizing the truth in her words. The old him, the warrior who had ridden with Iron Bear's band, would never have imagined sitting peacefully in a white woman's cabin, sharing a meal and conversation as equals. But dancing. Moon had been preparing him for this transformation long before he realized it. She would have liked you, he said quietly. She always said that there were good people in every nation, that the color of a person's skin told you nothing about the size of their heart. I wish I could have met her, Serafina replied. Any woman who could raise a man like you must have been extraordinary. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft breathing of the sleeping baby. Outside, the wind had died down and the morning was crisp and still. It was the kind of peace that Tate had not experienced in months, and he found himself reluctant to break it. But reality had a way of intruding on even the most perfect moments. The sound of horses approaching broke the morning quiet, and Tate was on his feet instantly, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. Through the window, he could see 3 riders coming up the path to the cabin soldiers from the fort, their blue uniforms dark against the pale morning sky. It's all right, Serafina said, rising and moving to the window. It's just private. Morrison and his men. They said they would check on us this morning, but Tate's warrior instincts were fully alert now. He could see the tension in the soldiers' postures, the way they kept their hands near their weapons. This was not a casual checkup. Something had changed. Morrison dismounted and approached the cabin, his young face serious. His companions remained mounted, their rifles across their saddles, ready for trouble. "Mrs. Hayes," Morrison called out. "We need to speak with you and the Apache." Serafina opened the door, her expression calm but wary. "What's wrong, Private?" "Captain Hartley needs to see Blackhawk immediately. There's been developments." Tate stepped into view, his hand still resting on his knife. "What kind of developments?" Morrison looked uncomfortable. "A patrol found sign of Apache raiders about 10 miles south of here. Fresh tracks, maybe a dozen warriors. The captain thinks they might be looking for you." The words hit Tate like a physical blow. If Iron Bear's warriors were nearby, it meant they had followed his trail, probably hoping to rescue him from the white man's prison. But it also meant that Serafina was now in danger, caught between two forces that had been enemies for generations. "My father's band," Tate said quietly. "They have come for me." "That's what the captain figures," Morrison replied. "He wants you back at the fort, where you can be protected." "Protected or imprisoned?" Tate asked, his voice hard. Morrison had the grace to look embarrassed. "I don't know, sir. I just follow orders." Serafina stepped forward, her chin raised. Defiantly, "And what about Swift Arrow? He's still too weak to travel, and he needs regular feeding. You can't separate him from his father." "Ma'am, I'm not sure that's our decision to make," Morrison said. "The captain's orders were clear. Blackhawk comes back with us now." "Then I'm coming too," Serafina said firmly. The soldiers exchanged glances. This was clearly not something they had been prepared for. "Ma'am, I don't care what you think, Private," Serafina interrupted. "That baby needs me, and I'm not going to abandon him. If you want to take his father, then you take all of us." Tate looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Serafina, you do not understand what you are saying. If my father's warriors are nearby, any white person with me will be seen as an enemy. I cannot ask you to put yourself in such danger." "You're not asking," she replied, her green eyes blazing. "I'm telling you. Swift Arrow is my responsibility now, and I don't abandon my responsibilities." There was something in her tone that reminded Tate of Dancing Moon's stubbornness, the same iron will wrapped in gentle words. He realized that this woman, who had seemed so fragile the night before, possessed a strength that ran deeper than any warrior's. "All right," Morrison said finally. "But we need to move quickly. The captain wants to get everyone inside the fort before those Apache warriors figure out where their missing man has gone." The next hour was a blur of activity. Serafina packed quickly, gathering essential supplies for the baby and a few personal belongings. Tate helped her, marveling at how naturally they worked together, like partners who had been preparing for journeys their entire lives. Swift Arrow woke during the commotion, but instead of crying, he looked around with alert, curious eyes. The transformation from the dying infant of the night before was remarkable. He was still weak, still small, but there was life in him now, a spark that had been missing for days. "He's getting stronger," Serafina observed as she fed him one more time before the journey. "Look at how he's holding his head up." "Dancing Moon's spirit is in him," Tate said, gently stroking his son's dark hair. "She will not let him go easily." As they prepared to leave, Serafina took one last look around her cabin. Tate could see the pain in her eyes. This place had been her refuge, her sanctuary from the world that had taken everything from her. Leaving it meant stepping back into uncertainty, into a world where she might lose everything all over again. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. "I can ask Captain Hartley to find another way." "No," she replied firmly. "This is what I choose. This is what I need to do." The journey to Fort Bridger took 2 hours, with Morrison and his men maintaining a careful watch for signs of Apache raiders. Serafina rode behind one of the soldiers, swift arrow secured in a sling across her chest, while Tate walked alongside them, his hands bound but loosely, a gesture toward security that fooled no one. As they traveled, Tate found himself scanning the horizon for signs of his father's warriors. He knew their methods, their patterns, the way they could move across country like ghosts. If they were nearby, they would be watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. But more than that, he found himself thinking about what would happen when they reached the fort. Would Captain Hartley honor his word to protect Swift Arrow? Would he allow Serafina to continue caring for the baby? Or would military necessity override human compassion? The fort appeared ahead of them, its wooden walls rising against the morning sky like a promise of safety or a threat of confinement, depending on your perspective. Tate felt a familiar tightness in his chest as they approached the gates, the same feeling he had experienced the night before, when he had stepped out of the shadows and into the light, not knowing if he would live or die. But this time, he was not alone. Serafina rode beside him, her presence a comfort and a strength he had never expected to find. And Swift Arrow, healthy and alert in her arms, was proof that sometimes the most impossible things could become possible. The gates swung open to admit them, and they entered a world of controlled chaos. Soldiers moved purposefully across the courtyard, checking weapons and supplies, preparing for the possibility of an Apache attack. The air was thick with tension and the smell of gun oil and leather. Captain Hartley was waiting for them in the center of the courtyard, his expression grave. He looked older than he had the night before, as if the weight of command had aged him years in just a few hours. "Blackhawk," he said as they approached, "I hope you understand the position you've put us all in." "I understand that I am a father who sought help for his dying son," Tate replied evenly. "Nothing more, nothing less. And now your people are out there, probably planning to attack my fort to get you back. That makes you more than just a father, doesn't it?" Tate considered this. "If they attack, it will not be on my orders. I gave you my word that I would not run, that I would submit to whatever fate you chose for me. I have kept that word." "And what about her?" Hartley asked, nodding toward Serafina. "You've dragged an innocent woman into this conflict." "I dragged no one," Tate replied. "She chose to come. Because she's caring for your son. Because she's gotten attached to an Apache baby. Because she's a good person who believes in doing what's right," Tate said, his voice heating slightly. "Something that seems to be rare in this world." Hartley studied him for a long moment, then turned his attention to Serafina. "Mrs. Hayes, I want to thank you for what you've done. Your help may have saved this child's life. But I need you to understand that this situation is about to become very dangerous. I can offer you the protection of the fort, but I cannot guarantee your safety if you remain involved with this man and his son." Serafina adjusted Swift Arrow in her arms, the baby content and peaceful despite the tension around them. "Captain, with respect, I've already lost everything that mattered to me once. I won't lose it again. This child needs me, and I need him. Where he goes, I go. Even if it means your death, even then." Hartley shook his head, but there was something like admiration in his eyes. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. Maybe both," Serafina replied with a slight smile. "But I'm also the only chance this baby has of surviving whatever comes next." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a scout, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with news. He dismounted quickly and approached the captain, his voice urgent. "Sir, Apache warriors have been spotted 3 miles south of here, at least a dozen, maybe more. They're moving this way." Hartley's jaw tightened. "How long do we have?" "Maybe an hour, sir." "2 at most." The captain turned back to Tate, his expression hard. "It looks like we're about to find out how much your word is worth, Blackhawk. Those are your people out there. If they attack this fort, Innocent people will die. Then let me go to them, Tate said without hesitation. Let me talk to them, explain what has happened. My father is a reasonable man. He will listen. And if he doesn't, if he decides that the only way to get you back is to burn this fort to the ground, then I will stand between him and these walls, Tate replied, his voice steady and sure. I will not let harm come to the people who have shown kindness to my son. Hartley looked at him for a long moment, weighing the risks and possibilities. Finally, he nodded. All right, Blackhawk. But if this goes wrong, if anyone dies because of your people, I'll hold you responsible. I understand. And Mrs. Hayes, you and the baby will remain here under guard until this is resolved. No, Serafina said firmly. If Tate is going out there to face his people, then Swift Arrow should be with him. They need to see that the baby is alive and healthy, that their mission has already succeeded. Ma'am, that's far too dangerous. Everything about this situation is dangerous, Captain. But that baby is the key to preventing bloodshed. His grandfather needs to see that he's safe, that he's being cared for. If Tate walks out there empty-handed, Iron Bear might think his grandson is dead. Tate felt his heart swell with admiration for this remarkable woman. Once again, she had seen what others had missed, had understood the deeper currents of the situation better than anyone. She is right, he said quietly. My father needs to see Swift Arrow alive and healthy. It is the only way to convince him that violence is not necessary. Hartley looked back and forth between them, clearly torn between military protocol and practical wisdom. Finally, he made his decision. All right. But I'm sending an escort with you. And if anything happens to Mrs. Hayes or that baby, I'll make sure you suffer for it. Nothing will happen to them, Tate promised. I stake my life on it. You already have, Hartley replied grimly. You already have. As the fort prepared for a possible siege, Tate Blackhawk stood at the gates, holding his son in his arms while Serafina Hayes stood beside him, her hand resting gently on Swift Arrow's head. They were about to walk into the unknown, to face warriors who might see them as enemies, to risk everything on the hope that love could triumph over generations of hatred and mistrust. But as Tate looked down at his son's peaceful face and felt the quiet strength of the woman who had become his unlikely partner in this desperate gamble, he knew that some things were worth any risk. The gates swung open, and they stepped out into the morning sunlight, walking toward whatever fate awaited them beyond the walls of Fort Bridger. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of brown grass and sagebrush beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. The morning sun cast long shadows across the earth, and the air carried the scent of approaching winter sharp, clean, and full of promises that could turn deadly without warning. Tate Blackhawk walked slowly across the open ground between Fort Bridger and the ridge where his father's warriors waited. Swift Arrow was secure in his arms, wrapped in one of Seraphine's soft blankets, the baby's dark eyes alert and curious as he took in the world around him. Serafina walked beside Tate, her chin raised with quiet determination, though he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. Behind them, at a respectful distance, came Captain Hartley and 3 of his best soldiers, their rifles ready but not aimed. It was a delicate balance, close enough to provide protection if needed, far enough back to avoid appearing aggressive. Everything about this moment balanced on a knife's edge. Tell me about your father, Serafina said quietly, her voice steady. Despite the circumstances, what should I expect? Tate considered the question, his eyes fixed on the ridge ahead where he could now make out the silhouettes of mounted warriors against the sky. Iron Bear is a man of honor, but he has seen too much betrayal, too much broken trust. He will judge you not by your words, but by your actions. And what actions will convince him that I'm not a threat? The fact that you are here, walking freely beside me with my son in my arms. The fact that you chose to come despite the danger. My father understands courage, even when it comes from unexpected places. They were close enough now to see individual figures among the warriors. Tate counted. 14 riders, all mounted on swift ponies, their weapons visible but not drawn. At their head sat a man who could only be Iron Bear tall and straight in his saddle despite his advanced years, his long gray hair braided with feathers and silver, his weathered face carved by decades of leadership and loss. The old chief's eyes found his son immediately, and Tate saw the relief that flickered across his father's features before being replaced by the stoic mask of a leader who could not afford to show weakness in front of his warriors. "Tate," Iron Bear called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "You live. I live, father. And so does your grandson." Tate held Swift Arrow higher, allowing the warriors to see the baby clearly. A murmur ran through the group. Several of them had known Dancing Moon, had been present at her wedding, had mourned her death. To see her child alive and healthy was a miracle they had not dared to hope for. Iron Bear dismounted with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback, and the other warriors followed suit. They approached slowly, their eyes taking in every detail of the scene before them, the white woman standing beside Tate, the healthy baby in his arms, the soldiers waiting in the distance. "We heard you had been captured," Iron Bear said, his gaze shifting to Seraphina. "We came to free you." "I was not captured, father. I came seeking help for Swift Arrow. He was dying, and this woman saved his life." Iron Bear's attention focused fully on Seraphina, and she felt the weight of his scrutiny like a physical force. This was a man who had led his people through decades of warfare, who had made life and death decisions with the fate of entire families hanging in the balance. His judgment would be swift and final. "You are the one who fed my grandson," he said, in careful English. "Yes," Seraphina replied, her voice clear and strong. "I am. Why?" The question was simple, but Seraphina understood that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the fate of everyone involved in this tense confrontation. "Because he needed help, and I could provide it. Because no child should suffer for the conflicts of adults. Because ... She paused, looking down at Swift Arrow's peaceful face. "Because I lost my own child, and I couldn't bear to watch another mother's son die when I had the power to save him." Iron Bear studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then, surprising everyone, he stepped forward and extended his hand toward the baby. "May I?" Tate nodded, carefully transferring Swift Arrow to his grandfather's arms. The old chief held the infant with the practiced ease of someone who had raised many children, his weathered hands gentle as they cradled the tiny form. "He is strong," Iron Bear observed, his voice softer now. "Stronger than when I last saw him. The milk sickness has passed." "Yes," Seraphina said. "He's eating well now, gaining weight. He'll be fine." "And you did this knowing that my son is a warrior who has fought against your people." "I did it knowing that he's a father who loves his son. Nothing else mattered." Iron Bear looked at her with something that might have been respect. "You have courage, white woman. But courage alone does not always keep one alive in this world." "No," Seraphina agreed. "But it's a start." The old chief carefully returned Swift Arrow to Tate's arms, then turned to address his warriors in rapid Apache. Tate listened intently, translating for Seraphina in whispered words. "He's telling them that the baby is safe and healthy, that you have shown great kindness to our family. He's saying that no harm must come to you under any circumstances." One of the younger warriors, a man with fierce eyes and fresh scars across his chest, spoke up in heavily accented English. "She is white. Whites killed my brother, stole our lands, drove us from our homes. Why should we trust her?" Iron Bear's response was swift and sharp, but Tate translated the essence of it for Seraphina. He said that hatred is like poison. It hurts the one who carries it more than the one it's aimed at. He said that you have proven yourself through your actions, not your words. The young warrior looked unconvinced, but he said nothing more. Iron Bear's authority was absolute, and his decision would be respected even by those who disagreed with it. What happens now? Serafina asked. Now we must decide, Iron Bear said, his gaze shifting between his son and the fort in the distance. The soldiers expect us to attack, to try to take Tate by force. But if we do, innocent people will die, including you and the baby. Then we don't attack, Tate said firmly. We find another way. And what way is that, my son? The white man's law says you are a criminal, a raider who must be punished. They will not simply let you go. Tate looked at Captain Hartley, who had moved close enough to hear the conversation. The officer's face was tense, his hand resting on his sidearm, but he made no aggressive moves. Captain, Tate called out, may I speak with you? Hartley approached cautiously, his men staying back but ready. What is it, Blackhawk? My father speaks the truth. Your law demands punishment for the raids I participated in. But I propose a different solution. I'm listening. Let me stand trial. In a proper court, with witnesses and evidence. If I am found guilty, I will accept whatever punishment is given. But if I am found innocent, or if the court shows mercy, then I should be free to go. Hartley frowned. That's a dangerous gamble, Blackhawk. Territorial judges aren't known for their mercy toward Apache raiders. Perhaps not, but it is better than bloodshed. And it gives everyone a chance to see that justice can be done without violence. Iron Bear listened to this exchange with growing interest. You would trust the white man's justice? After all we have seen of their courts. I would trust it more than I trust war, Tate replied. And I would trust it because I believe there are good people among the whites, just as there are among our people. People like Serafina, who judge others by their actions rather than their heritage. The old chief looked at his son with something like pride. Dancing Moon taught you well. She always said that the future belonged to those who could build bridges between worlds. She was right, Tate said. And Swift Arrow will need those bridges. If he is to grow up in a world where Apache and white children can play together without fear. Serafina felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of that vision. She thought of her own lost child, of the future that had been stolen from him, and realized that perhaps there was a way to honor his memory by helping to create a better world for other children. Captain Hartley, she said, stepping forward. I would be willing to testify on Tate's behalf, to speak about the character of the man I've come to know. And I would be willing to speak for the character of the woman who saved my grandson's life, Iron Bear added, his English careful but clear. There are two sides to every story, and both should be heard. Hartley looked around at the assembled group: Apache warriors and white soldiers, a tribal chief and a frontier widow, a desperate father and his infant son. It was like something out of a fever dream. A scene that should have been impossible in the harsh reality of the American West. This is highly irregular, he said finally. I'll have to contact the territorial authorities, arrange for a proper hearing. It could take weeks. Then we wait, Iron Bear said simply. My warriors and I will make camp near the fort. We will cause no trouble, raid no settlements, harm no innocent people. But we will stay until justice is done. And if justice means your son is executed, the old chief's face was grave. Then we will mourn, and we will remember, and we will hope that his death serves some greater purpose. But we will not seek revenge. I give you my word. Hartley shook his head in amazement. I've been fighting Apache for 15 years, and I never thought I'd see the day when a war chief would voluntarily camp within rifle range of a cavalry fort. Perhaps, Iron Bear said with a slight smile, you have never had the right reason to trust an Apache before. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Messages were sent to the territorial capital, requesting a judge and legal counsel. Temporary camps were established. with the Apache warriors setting up their tipis on a ridge overlooking the fort while maintaining a respectful distance from the white settlement. Serafina found herself at the center of it all, caring for Swift Arrow while serving as an unofficial ambassador between two worlds that had rarely found common ground. She helped translate not just words but cultural concepts, explaining Apache customs to curious soldiers and white customs to equally curious warriors. Most remarkably, she found herself developing a genuine friendship with Iron Bear, who visited daily to see his grandson and often stayed to discuss philosophy, politics, and the future of both their peoples. "You remind me of my daughter-in-law," he told her one evening as they sat beside a campfire, Swift Arrow sleeping peacefully in her arms. Dancing Moon also believed that understanding could overcome hatred. "I'm honored by the comparison," Serafina replied. "From what Tate has told me, she was an extraordinary woman. She was. And she would have been proud to see how her son has grown, how he has learned to choose wisdom over warfare. He's a good man, a good father." Iron Bear nodded. "And you are a good woman. A good mother, even to a child who is not yours by blood." The words hit Serafina like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were so unexpectedly kind. She had been thinking of herself as merely a caretaker, a temporary solution to a desperate problem. But Iron Bear saw something more. He saw her as a true mother to Swift Arrow, someone who had claimed the child not through biology but through love. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." "I do know," Iron Bear said gently. "The heart's greatest grief is often followed by its greatest joy. Your lost child prepared you to love this one. That is the way of the Great Spirit. Nothing is ever truly lost, only transformed." As the days passed and they waited for the territorial judge to arrive, something remarkable happened. The rigid boundaries between Apache and white began to blur. Soldiers shared coffee with warriors, children from the fort played games with Apache boys, and women from both cultures exchanged recipes and stories. At the center of it all were Tate, Serafina, and Swift Arrow, a living symbol of what was possible when people chose trust over fear, love over hatred, hope over despair. The meeting of worlds had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 weeks had passed since the unprecedented peace between Fort Bridger and Iron Bear's warriors began, and the small frontier settlement had transformed into something no one could have imagined. What had started as a desperate attempt to save a dying infant had evolved into an experiment in coexistence that drew visitors from across the territory. The territorial judge, Honorable Marcus Whitmore, had arrived 2 days earlier with his clerk and a small entourage of officials. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. His reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for harsh sentences when he deemed them necessary. The makeshift courthouse had been set up in the fort's main assembly hall, with rough wooden benches arranged for spectators and a simple table serving as the judge's bench. The American flag hung from one wall, while Iron Bear had been granted permission to display a traditional Apache peace pipe on the opposite wall, a gesture that had surprised everyone, including the judge himself. Serafina sat in the front row, Swift Arrow sleeping peacefully in her arms. The baby had grown remarkably in the past weeks, his cheeks now round and healthy, his dark eyes bright with curiosity. He had become the unofficial mascot of the unusual gathering, equally beloved by Apache warriors and cavalry soldiers. The hall was packed with an unprecedented mixture of people. Apache warriors sat beside white settlers, their weapons set aside in a gesture of mutual respect. Soldiers mingled with tribal elders, and frontier women shared whispered conversations with Apache grandmothers. The air was thick with tension. But it was the tension of hope rather than fear. Tate stood at the defendant's table, his hands free of shackles at Judge Whitmore's insistence. A man who voluntarily submits to justice should not be treated like a common criminal, the judge had declared. Beside him sat his appointed counsel, a young lawyer named David Preston who had traveled from Denver specifically for this case. The prosecution was handled by Territorial Attorney General Robert Kane, a man with political ambitions who had initially seen this trial as an opportunity to make headlines by securing the conviction of a notorious Apache raider. But as the days had passed and he had witnessed the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the case, his certainty had begun to waver. "All rise," the clerk announced. "The Territorial Court of Wyoming is now in session, the Honorable Marcus Whitmore presiding." Judge Whitmore took his seat, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to determine the guilt or innocence of Tate Blackhawk, also known as Tate Crowfeather, on charges of armed robbery, assault, and conspiracy to commit acts of violence against the citizens of Wyoming Territory." He paused, his eyes finding Tate's. "Before we proceed, I want to make something clear. This court recognizes no distinction between white man and red man, between soldier and warrior, between Christian and heathen. We are all equal under the law, and justice will be dispensed accordingly." The prosecutor rose to present his case, laying out the evidence against Tate with methodical precision. There were witness testimonies about raids on supply trains, reports of stolen horses and weapons, accounts of violence that had left good men dead and families devastated. The defendant, Kane declared, is a self-confessed member of Iron Bear's raiding party. He has admitted to participating in acts of violence against innocent settlers. The law is clear such actions constitute serious crimes punishable by death. But when Preston rose to present the defense, the tone of the proceedings shifted dramatically. Instead of denying the charges, he chose to tell a different story, the story of a people driven from their ancestral lands, of families torn apart by government policies, of warriors who fought not for conquest, but for survival. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Preston said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "I do not dispute that Tate Blackhawk participated in actions that the law defines as crimes. But I ask you to consider the context of those actions. This man was not a common criminal seeking personal gain. He was a warrior defending his people's way of life." The defense called witness after witness, each one painting a picture of Tate that went far beyond the simple image of a raider. Captain Hartley testified about the Apache's voluntary surrender and his willingness to risk everything to save his son. Several soldiers spoke about his honor and his word, which he had kept even under the most difficult circumstances. But it was when Serafina took the stand that the courtroom fell completely silent. "Mrs. Hayes," Preston said gently, "please tell the court how you came to know the defendant." Serafina adjusted Swift Arrow in her arms, her voice clear and steady as she recounted the events of that desperate night. She spoke of Tate's desperation, his willingness to humble himself before enemies for the sake of his child, and the trust he had shown in allowing her to care for his son. "This man," she said, her green eyes finding Tate's across the courtroom, "is not the savage that some would paint him to be. He is a father who loves his son more than his own life. He is a man of honor who keeps his word even when it costs him everything. He is someone who has shown me that the color of a person's skin tells you nothing about the size of their heart." The prosecutor's cross-examination was relentless, but Serafina never wavered. Yes, she knew that Tate had participated in raids. Yes, she understood that people had died. But she also knew that war was never simple, that violence begets violence, and that the only way to break the cycle was through understanding and forgiveness. "Are you saying, Mrs. Hayes, that we should simply ignore the crimes committed by Apache raiders?" Kane pressed. "I'm saying that we should look beyond the crimes, to the reasons behind them. I'm saying that a man who would risk his life to save his child, who would voluntarily submit to justice rather than see innocent people harmed, is a man who deserves a chance at redemption. The most dramatic moment came when Iron Bear himself took the stand. The old chief spoke in careful English, his dignity unshakable despite the hostile stares of some in the audience. "My son is a warrior," he said simply. "He has fought to defend our people, our way of life. But he is also a father, and a father's first duty is to his children. When his son was dying, he chose to seek help rather than let pride cost him everything. That is not the action of a criminal. That is the action of a man who understands what truly matters." The prosecutor tried to trap Iron Bear into admitting that the raids had been motivated by pure aggression, but the old chief was too wise to fall into such a simple trap. "You ask if we fought for conquest," Iron Bear said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of leadership. "We fought for survival. You ask if we killed for pleasure. We killed to protect our families. You ask if we raided for profit. We raided to feed our children when the white man's government promised us food that never came." The courtroom was completely silent as Iron Bear continued. "I do not ask you to forgive what we have done. I ask you to understand why we did it. And I ask you to see that my son has chosen a different path, a path of peace, of trust, of hope, for a better future." The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. The prosecutor emphasized the need for law and order, the importance of deterring future violence, the duty of the court to protect innocent citizens from Apache raids. But Preston's closing was a masterpiece of legal reasoning and emotional appeal. He spoke of justice tempered with mercy, of the difference between punishment and vengeance, of the opportunity to break the cycle of violence that had plagued the territory for decades. "Ladies and gentlemen," he concluded, "you have the power to write history today. You can choose to perpetuate the hatred and violence that has torn this land apart, or you can choose to begin the healing." Tate Blackhawk stands before you not as a conquering enemy, but as a man who has learned that love is stronger than hate, that hope is more powerful than fear. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, their voices occasionally rising in heated debate. Behind the closed doors of the jury room, outside, Apache warriors and white settlers waited together, their shared anxiety creating an unlikely bond. Serafina sat with Swift Arrow, surrounded by a small group of women, both Apache and white, who had become unlikely friends over the past weeks. They spoke little, but their presence was a comfort to her as she waited for the verdict that would determine not just Tate's fate, but the future of the fragile peace they had all helped to create. When the jury finally returned, Judge Whitmore called the court to order. The foreman, a weathered rancher named Tom Bradley, stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of the charges of armed robbery and assault," he announced, and Serafina felt her heart sink like a stone. But Bradley wasn't finished. "However, we recommend mercy due to the extraordinary circumstances of this case and the defendant's demonstrated character and willingness to submit to justice." Judge Whitmore nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Tate Blackhawk, you have been found guilty of serious crimes against the people of this territory. Under normal circumstances, these crimes would carry a sentence of death by hanging." The courtroom was so quiet that the only sound was Swift Arrow's gentle breathing in Seraphine's arms. "However," the judge continued, "this court recognizes that these are not normal circumstances. Your actions, while technically criminal, were motivated by the desperate situation of your people and your genuine desire to protect your family. Your voluntary surrender and cooperation with this court demonstrate a character that transcends the simple label of criminal." He paused, looking directly at Tate. "Therefore, this court sentences you to time served, with the understanding that you will remain in the custody of your father, Chief Iron Bear, and that you will work to maintain the peace that has been established here." The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears. Apache warriors embracing cavalry soldiers, and frontier women weeping with joy. Serafina felt tears streaming down her face as she clutched Swift Arrow to her chest, hardly daring to believe that it was over. Tate stood motionless for a moment, as if unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then Iron Bear was beside him, the old chief's weathered hand resting on his son's shoulder. "The trial is over," Iron Bear said quietly. "Now the real work begins." As the crowd began to disperse, Serafina made her way to Tate, Swift Arrow reaching out his tiny hands toward his father. The baby's simple gesture seemed to sum up everything that had happened: the reaching across divides, the trust extended despite fear, the hope for a better future. "What happens now?" Serafina asked as Tate took his son in his arms. "Now we build the bridge that Dancing Moon dreamed of," he replied. "Now we show the world that Apache and White can live together in peace." "And Swift Arrow?" Tate looked down at his son, then back at Serafina. "Swift Arrow has two mothers now, and a grandfather who will teach him the old ways, and a world that is slowly learning that love is stronger than hate." The weight of judgment had been lifted, but the weight of responsibility was just beginning. The real test would come not in a courtroom, but in the daily work of building trust between peoples who had been enemies for generations. 5 years had passed since the trial that changed everything, and the Wyoming Territory had witnessed transformations that no one could have predicted. What began as a desperate father's plea for milk had grown into something far greater, a living example of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred, cooperation over conflict. The settlement that had grown up around Fort Bridger now bore little resemblance to the isolated military outpost it had once been. Streets lined with both log cabins and traditional Apache dwellings wound between carefully tended gardens where White and Apache children played together. The sound of multiple languages filled the air: English, Apache, Spanish, and the various dialects of the settlers who had been drawn to this unique community. At the heart of it all stood a large stone building that served as both school and meeting hall. Above its entrance, carved in both English and Apache, were the words that had become the settlement's motto: "Where two worlds become one." Serafina Hayes, now Serafina Blackhawk, stood in the doorway of the school, watching as Swift Arrow played with a group of children in the yard. At 5 years old, he was tall for his age, with his father's dark hair and eyes but his mother's gentle smile. He moved easily between the White and Apache children, switching languages as naturally as breathing, equally at home with both cultures. "Mama Sira," Swift Arrow called out, using the name he had chosen for her when he first learned to speak. "Look what Grandfather Iron Bear taught me." The boy demonstrated a traditional Apache hunting technique he had learned, his small hands moving with precision as he mimicked the motions of drawing a bow. The other children watched with fascination, and Serafina felt the familiar swell of pride and love that Swift Arrow never failed to inspire in her. "Very good, sweetheart," she called back. "But don't forget you have arithmetic lessons this afternoon." Swift Arrow made a face that was so comically exaggerated that several of the other children burst into laughter. He had inherited his father's warrior spirit, but he was also a typical 5-year-old who would much rather play than study. "Is that my son causing trouble again?" Tate's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and amusement. Serafina turned to find her husband approaching, his arms full of firewood for the school stove. The years had been kind to him, the gaunt desperation that had marked his features during those first desperate days had been replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. "He's not causing trouble," Serafina said, reaching up to brush a wood chip from Tate's shoulder. "He's just being a child. A perfectly normal, healthy, happy child." Tate set down the firewood and pulled her into his arms, a gesture that still made her heart skip after 3 years of marriage. Their wedding had been the first ceremony of its kind in the territory, a blend of Apache and Christian traditions that had drawn visitors from hundreds of miles away. "Any word from the territorial governor?" Serafina asked, referring to the letter they had been expecting. Tate nodded, his expression growing serious. "Captain Hartley brought it this morning. Governor Thomas wants to visit next month. He's heard about what we've accomplished here, and he wants to see for himself whether our model could be replicated in other parts of the territory. And what do you think? I think it's about time. We've proven that Apache and white can live together in peace. We've shown that children can grow up without the hatred that poisoned our parents' generation. But if it's going to spread beyond our little corner of Wyoming, we need the government's support." Serafina nodded, understanding the weight of what this visit could mean. They had built something remarkable here, but it remained fragile, dependent on the goodwill of individuals, rather than the protection of law. If they could convince the territorial government to formally recognize and support their model, it could be the beginning of a new era. "Papa, Mama Sira." Swift Arrow came running over, his face flushed with excitement. "Grandfather Iron Bear says there's going to be a big ceremony tonight. He says the whole tribe is coming." Tate smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "That's right, little warrior. Tonight we celebrate the 5th anniversary of the peace treaty. All the bands that have joined. US will be here." What had started with Iron Bear's small group of warriors had grown into something unprecedented. Word of the successful coexistence at Fort Bridger had spread throughout the Apache Nation, and gradually, other bands had come to join the experiment. Not all had stayed. Some found the compromise too difficult, the adjustment too challenging, but enough had remained to create a thriving community of nearly 300 Apache living in harmony with an equal number of white settlers. The celebration that evening was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. The main street of the settlement was lined with lanterns and torches, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the crowd. Long tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by both Apache and white women. Roasted venison and beef, fresh bread and traditional Apache corn cakes, vegetables from the community gardens, and pies made with wild berries gathered from the surrounding hills. Iron Bear, now in his 70s but still commanding in presence, stood to address the assembled crowd. His hair was completely white now, but his eyes remained sharp and his voice strong. "My friends," he began, speaking in English out of respect for the mixed audience. "5 years ago, my grandson was dying. My son was desperate. A white woman showed kindness to a stranger, and from that kindness, all of this has grown." He gestured to the crowd around him, children playing together regardless of their heritage, men and women of different races working side by side, families that had been created not by blood, but by choice. The old ways said that Apache and white must be enemies forever, but Swift Arrow's mother in heaven had a different vision. She saw that children could build bridges that warriors could never cross. She saw that love could conquer hatred, that understanding could defeat fear. The old chief's gaze found Serafina in the crowd, and he smiled. "My daughter-in-law was born white, but she has an Apache heart. She has raised my grandson to be proud of both his heritages, to see strength in diversity rather than weakness. Through her love, my son has learned the greatest warriors are not always those who fight the hardest, but those who know when to lay down their weapons and build instead of destroy." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Serafina felt tears streaming down her face. When she had first held Swift Arrow that desperate night 5 years ago, she had thought she was simply helping a dying baby. She had never imagined that she was planting the seeds of a new world. Tate stood next, Swift Arrow perched on his shoulders. "My father speaks truly," he said, his voice carrying easily across the crowd. "But this community is not the work of one person or one family. It is the work of all of us, every person who chose to trust instead of fear, every parent who taught their children to see past the color of skin to the content of character, every individual who believed that we could build something better than what we inherited." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some Apache, some white, some the children of mixed marriages that had become increasingly common in the settlement. Tonight, we celebrate not just the past 5 years, but the future that stretches. Before us, Swift Arrow and the other children will grow up in a world where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where cooperation is the norm rather than the exception. They will build upon what we have started and create something even greater. The formal speeches gave way to music and dancing, with traditional Apache drums mixing with fiddles and harmonicas. Children ran between the dancers, their laughter adding to the joyful chaos. Adults who had once been enemies now shared stories and jokes, their former animosity replaced by genuine friendship. Serafina found herself sitting with a group of women, both Apache and white, who had become her closest friends over the years. They talked about their children, their gardens, their hopes for the future. The conversation flowed easily between languages, with translations provided naturally by whoever was most fluent. "Do you remember that first night?" asked Mary Henderson, a white woman whose husband had been one of the soldiers who escorted Tate to Seraphine's cabin. "When we thought the world was ending?" "I remember thinking that nothing would ever be the same," replied Singing Bird, Tate's sister, who had arrived with one of the later bands. "I was right, but not in the way I expected. Sometimes the best changes come from the most unexpected places," Serafina said, watching as Swift Arrow taught a group of white children a traditional Apache dance. "That night, I thought I was just helping a hungry baby. I never imagined I was helping to change the world." "The world changed because you were willing to change," said Helena Morales, a Mexican woman who had married into the Apache community. "You could have turned away, could have let fear rule your heart. But you chose love instead." As the evening wore on, Serafina found herself drawn to the edge of the celebration, where she could watch the joyful chaos from a distance. The sight never failed to move her, the tangible proof that her impossible dream had become reality. Tate found her there, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Dancing moon," Serafina replied. "I wish she could see this. I wish she could see how her son has grown, how her vision has become reality." "She can see it," Tate said with quiet conviction. "She is here, with us, in every act of kindness, every moment of understanding, every bridge built between hearts that were once separated by fear." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their son play with his friends. Swift Arrow moved easily between the different groups, equally at home with Apache warriors and white settlers, Mexican vaqueros and mixed-race children. He was the living embodiment of the world they had worked to create, a world where heritage was celebrated but not divisive, where difference was strength rather than weakness. "The governor's visit," Serafina said eventually. "What if he doesn't understand? What if he sees threat instead of opportunity? Then we'll show him what we've shown everyone else," Tate replied. "We'll show him that love is stronger than hate, that cooperation is more powerful than conflict. We'll show him Swift Arrow and the other children, and we'll let them speak for themselves." A few days later, Governor Thomas arrived with a small entourage of officials and newspaper reporters. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the sharp eyes of a politician, assessing every situation for its political implications. The settlement had prepared carefully for his visit, organizing demonstrations of their integrated schools, their joint farming projects, their collaborative law enforcement system. But it was the unplanned moments that proved most powerful. The Apache grandmother teaching white children to weave baskets, the white doctor working alongside the Apache medicine man to treat a sick child, the mixed groups of teenagers discussing their plans for the future. "This is remarkable," the governor admitted to Tate and Serafina as they toured the settlement. "I've seen attempts at integration before, but nothing like this. How do you maintain the peace? How do you resolve conflicts between the different groups?" "The same way families resolve conflicts," Serafina replied. We talk, we listen, we compromise. We remember that we're all part of the same community, working toward the same goals. And when talking doesn't work, then we turn to the council, Tate explained. Representatives from each group, Apache, white, Mexican, mixed race, work together to find solutions. Iron Bear chairs the council, but every voice is heard and every opinion is valued. The governor shook his head in amazement. I've been in politics for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. You've created something that shouldn't be possible, a truly integrated community where different races and cultures live together in harmony. It's not perfect, Serafina admitted. We still have disagreements, still have people who struggle with the changes. But we've proven that it's possible, that people can choose cooperation over conflict. That evening, the governor attended a special council meeting where children from the settlement presented their vision for the future. Swift Arrow, now confident and articulate despite his young age, stood before the assembled adults and spoke with the passion of someone who had never known a world divided by racial hatred. My papa is Apache and my mama is white, he said, his clear voice carrying throughout the room. But I'm not half of anything. I'm whole. I'm American. I'm a child of two worlds, and both worlds are better because they came together. The governor wiped his eyes as the boy continued, speaking of his dreams for a future where all children could grow up as he had, with love and acceptance rather than fear and prejudice. This boy, the governor said later to his aides, represents the future of this territory. If we can replicate what they've done here, we might just be able to build a civilization worthy of the name. The formal announcement came a month later. The territorial government would provide official recognition and support for the Fort Bridger model, with plans to establish similar communities throughout Wyoming and beyond. Federal funding would be provided for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure. Most importantly, the legal framework would be established to protect these integrated communities from those who would seek to destroy them. That the news spread quickly throughout the territory and beyond. Newspaper reporters arrived from as far away as New York and San Francisco, eager to document the miracle in Wyoming that had achieved what many thought impossible. But for Serafina and Tate, the real miracle was much simpler and more personal. It was Swift Arrow's laughter as he played with his friends. It was the sight of Iron Bear teaching white children Apache stories. It was the knowledge that Dancing Moon's vision had become reality, that love had indeed conquered hatred, that the bridge between worlds was strong enough to carry the weight of the future. On a warm spring evening, as the sun set over the Wyoming plains, Serafina sat on her porch with Swift Arrow on her lap, reading him a story. The book was written in both English and Apache, created by the settlement's teachers to help children maintain their connection to both cultures. Mama Sarah, Swift Arrow said, looking up at her with eyes that held wisdom beyond his years. Will you tell me again about the night Papa came to you? Serafina smiled, settling back in her chair. She had told this story countless times, but she never tired of it. It was their family's creation myth, the moment when their world had begun. It was a cold November night, she began, her voice taking on the rhythm of a familiar tale. Your papa was carrying you through the darkness, and you were so sick that he thought he might lose you. But he loved you too much to give up. He risked everything to save you, and in saving you, he saved all of us. Swift Arrow nodded solemnly, having heard this story many times before. But then he asked a question that surprised her. Mama Sarah, do you think Dancing Moon knew what would happen? Do you think she knew that her baby would bring peace? Serafina was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I think she hoped, sweetheart. I think she dreamed of a world where Apache and white children could play together, where love would be stronger than fear. And I think she knew that you would be special, that you would help build the bridge between worlds. And now we have that world, Swift Arrow said with satisfaction. Yes, Serafina agreed, pulling him closer. Now we have that world. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, Serafina reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a desperate father's plea for milk, a starving baby, and a woman who had lost everything but found the courage to hope again. It had grown into something that had changed not just their lives, but the lives of hundreds of others. Bridge Between Worlds was complete, strong enough to carry the weight of the future, built not of stone and steel but of love and understanding. And at its heart was a child who had never known a world divided by hatred, who represented the hope that Dancing Moon had carried in her heart as she brought him into the world. The story that had begun with a single act of kindness had become something greater, a testament to the power of love to overcome hatred, of understanding to defeat fear, of hope to triumph over despair. And in the laughter of children playing together regardless of their heritage, in the sight of former enemies now working side by side, in the knowledge that the future would be better than the past, the true miracle of Fort Bridger lived on. Apache widower's desperate plea for milk had indeed led to something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had led to a new world, a better world, a world where the bridge between different peoples was built not of politics or treaties, but of love, the love of a father for his son, the love of a woman for a child not her own, the love of a community, for the vision of something greater than what they had inherited. And in that love, Dancing Moon's dream had finally come true.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.